So can I welcome to the stage our next panellists? I'll do a brief introduction as they appear, I hope. I hope. Yes, we are. Good, welcome. Okay, so for this panel, we will be joined by the Honourable Tim Groser, and these are not full biographies, those are in your program, but Tim was, of course, lead trade negotiator for New Zealand, a government minister of trade, of climate change and foreign affairs, and importantly here, ambassador representing our country in the United States in Washington, DC for a number of years. Leon Grice, a former Consul General to Los Angeles, representing New Zealand, chair of the New Zealand-US Council, and more in the business sphere, has led a range of tech and media companies. And Rebecca Wright, leading journalist, former host of Newshub Nation, and importantly here, spent 3 years in New York as US correspondent for TV News here. So a very well-informed panel with very different takes, different experiences to bring to this. So I will just get back to the seat. And we could go for hours, but I'll ask some opening questions to each of you, and then please obviously put questions through on this. And I'm going to start with you, Rebecca.
Oh, okay.
If you are only reading New Zealand media, you might be thinking, how did this election result happen? Because at a 90% level, probably 95% level, New Zealand media would say this is crazy, this is terrible, and yet Trump has just won the popular vote. Why did this happen? What's happening on the ground in the States that we are not seeing through the lens of our local media here?
I think it's easy to get caught up in this sort of the churn of the Trump administration or the Trump candidacy, and all of the big headlines that come out of there don't make a lot of sense unless you are really tuned in to the fine detail as well. For me, there were two turning points for Donald Trump when he came, that paved the way for him to return to the Oval Office. And they happened quite far apart. The first one was his criminal trial in New York City, where he was being tried for paying hush money to a porn star. Now, that's a pretty hectic headline, but I think what happened there is the spotlight swung around to him. He'd been in political oblivion down at Mar-a-Lago for 3 years at that point. But when he was put on trial in New York City and those cameras every day, the thing that we know about Donald Trump is that he craves the spotlight, and he's able to turn things that end most political careers into gold. And that's what he did during that trial. Even though he was found guilty of 34 felonies, I think he raised $141 million in the days after those guilty verdicts. So when he gets in trouble, it galvanizes his support. And that is something that is distinct to Donald Trump. I can't imagine any politician here getting away with one of the things he's done or said. But for him, it is his superpower. It makes him bigger. The second one, in terms of the turning point, we saw this during the first Trump administration when there was the Russia investigation, there was being investigated for impeachment. When people go after him, that is, when he's in his element, he loves to fight. The second event, I suppose, that sort of secured, I think, his nomination, then his presidency, was when we saw him nearly get assassinated live on television. And he came up from behind that podium with sort of blood streaming down his face, with his fist in the air, and he said, "Fight." That became instantly iconic, and it scrambled the race for a while. The Democrats didn't know what to do with that. That is, sort of the image of Donald Trump that his supporters wanted to see. And these were two massive events happening, in the context of this quite chaotic campaign. I think that secured his road back to the White House.
Fascinating. Lots to go, Leon.
Disagree with that.
Right.
I think Trump, and I got it wrong in LA when I was living in LA on the first election, and the same. The information you get, you can only digest here, and so I couldn't predict the last election. But Trump did the same thing. In his first election that he won and the second election he won, he talked directly to the American people. Rally after rally after rally after rally, directly to the people, with a social media engine, and he just talked past. He talked past Fox News. Fox News, was supposedly be a right-wing, wasn't interested really in feeding Fox News. He wasn't interested in CNN, and he just talked past them. And so the mainstream media, I know it can be an abusive term, was made irrelevant by his campaign. And it makes it so hard. So I think the answers to actually understanding those elections is my son's generation. They're plugged into social media networks. They see things far more quickly of what's going on in the United States, because he remains plugged into those networks, having lived there with us. He's a better political commentator than I am, and I'm obsessed by it.
Yeah.
But both things can be true, can't they? Both things. You can be dominating the headlines, and you can have you can sort of manage events, and you can also be dominating social media. And we saw what you're talking about, Leon, when he went on the Joe Rogan podcast. All of these things add up. No one of them explains why he's back in the White House. But yeah, it's an extraordinary sort of set of events. And here we are.
Tim, what's your take?
Well, I won't give another analysis of why he won. I mean, I've talked in public about that before the election. Fundamentally, the reason he won was because 2/3 of Americans felt the country was going in the wrong direction, and the Democratic Party, forgetting the importance of the adjective democratic in front of Peter Party, they put up a candidate in defiance of that, thinking they could con the American people. Oh, he'll be good until he's 86. And that exploded in their face. And then we had the impossibility of the Kamala Harris candidature coming into and changing the picture dramatically. The fundamental takeaway, however, is that this was not a landslide victory for Trump. And this is very important because we should now be looking forward. So the margin of popular vote was the lowest for 25 years. The lower house, the House of Reps, is on a knife edge, depending on how you measure it. The Speaker has to manage a majority between 1 and 5. The smart money would be already on the Democrats flipping the House. If you want to know what a landslide looks like, out of the 276, is it, the figure of electoral college votes you've got to get? She won 226 electoral college votes. Al Gore in 1984, if you want to know what a landslide was, won 13, won 3. And yet, 2 years later, the Democrats flipped the House. So, if the cliche about a week is a long time in politics is true, and I believe it's fundamentally true, 2 years is an age. So this will start to impose constraints on the way looking forward. Anyway, so that's, I don't want to go into an analysis of the, complicated numbers and what the polling, exit polls showed. It's very interesting, but the fundamental reality is this, and I'll use this before in some other comments I've been making recently. If we start with the very perceptive comment made about Trump in 2016, when he became the 45th president, that the mad MAGA people that are so supportive of Trump, they take him seriously but not literally. And the people that can't stand Trump take him literally but not seriously. Campay can be. I think it's very important, if there are any folk out there who still want to put their tent in Camp B, shift it across to Camp A, because everybody should be taking him seriously but not literally. Now, the second point is I get slightly annoyed. I understand it, but I get slightly annoyed when I hear person after person, not just in New Zealand, of course, saying, well, we can't do anything about this because he's completely unpredictable. Well, he's unpredictable about specifically what the real end game is and where it's going to land, whether it's tariffs, or Mar-a-Lago in the Gaza, or so on and so forth. But he's utterly predictable, as I've argued before, in terms of the direction of travel. So on trade, and I'm happy to elaborate in any detail you want, but I mean, he's completely consistent. He's a protectionist, end of story. And that can be predicted right now, but the precise form in which it comes out, that's not clear. And if we had him right here in this seat, he couldn't tell you where it's going to come out, but it's not going to come out well.
Interesting times. All right. We won't spend all of our time diagnosing what's just happened in the election. A lot of this is going to be looking forward, but I have got a couple of points here. One, Leon, you've got a background in tech. You've lived in California for a long time. One of the things that happened is, California could have ceded from the union in the first Trump administration. This time, tech came out for Trump. So Elon most famously, but Andreessen Horowitz endorsed. You saw the lineup of the tech billionaires at the inauguration. Why did tech come out for Trump?
Complex money, for a start. But I also think, and I think in some ways it's a very small part, but the Christchurch call encapsulates the policy tension between freedom of speech and safe speech, or censored speech. And so after the Christchurch call, the social media platforms decided that they were going to make the speech that was happening in the public square on their social media platforms safer by moderating and creating councils of censors and advisors. And so we're playing with that policy, and that was part of the Christchurch call that Prime Minister Ardern and President Macron was working on. And it just became increasingly unworkable for them. And Trump, through this period, which is, and his supporters were all about free speech. And so we've seen those, particularly the social media platforms owned by Zuckerberg and Microsoft. They've now moved to community notes. So let the public square sort it out. We're not going to censor it anymore. So for me, that was sort of a tipping point for the moguls. They're going to make more money out of that, and they can return to the support of freedom of speech. It's a very tricky issue, the freedom of speech, particularly anonymous free speech. But I think that the pendulum swung that way, and they wanted to get him behind that. So that would be one, I think, interesting aspect. But apart from the other, I think they want to be Trump's national champions, particularly with China.
Can I? So I'm going to bounce off that and go your way, Rebecca. Because it is connected in the social media landscape and in freedom of speech, and you're having some people critique the lack of fact-checking and so on, and other people saying, well, what's a fact? What's truth? What's happening in the US media landscape that plays into this? And I ask that with the lens of, is it just the same as here, maybe 6 months ahead, or is it going to happen here if it's not happening yet? What's your take?
Well, I think Donald Trump started all of that with his fake news, his assault on the news media the last time in the United States, and how many of the media covered Donald Trump during that time, exacerbated it. So you got these deeper divisions within news organisations. I'm thinking, the New York Times in particular, but that you could name any one of them. CNN is another. You've got Fox. It's a very polarised media environment there. And so I think he sort of began that spiral, and it does travel, down the pipe here to New Zealand. When I first came back, I couldn't imagine the sort of division and the polarisation that was happening in the United States at that time landing here, and now I see parts of it everywhere. I think in terms of tech swinging in behind Donald Trump, it's interesting. I was talking to some friends of mine who are in Silicon Valley. They were here in New Zealand a week or so ago. I said, what do you think is going on there? Particularly with Elon Musk, who now seems to be, second in charge, despite not being on the ballot. Surprising to everyone, probably to him as well. But he said that Elon Musk, in particular, thrives in chaos almost as much as Donald Trump, perhaps as much as Donald Trump. And in terms of the big tech companies swinging in behind him, it is where there is sort of chaos, it is a really good environment to try just about anything. So they're taking advantage of the opportunity of the second Trump administration. I think Doge, I think everybody in the world knows who Doge is right now, and you know what Elon Musk is up to will be highly scrutinised. But yeah, it is fascinating that these people he was never pro-tech before, pro-big tech before. Now they're in the Oval Office.
Done a deal.
It's extraordinary, yeah. It's fascinating to watch.
If you haven't watched the Elon Musk interview in the office in a baseball cap with a baby sitting beside his foot.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
He said during that, in terms of scrutiny and whether he was being scrutinised and whether there would be transparency, I think he said it's like getting a daily proctology exam. And I thought that is probably how everybody in the federal government feels when your team turns up, as well. So it cuts both ways, that analogy.
I'm going to go back to you in a moment here, Tim. So one obvious one, I don't know, is anybody, aside from you maybe and Professor Anna Strutt, up to speed on the latest tariff announcements? No. They're moving fast, they're being announced, they're being withdrawn, they're being delayed for a month. New Zealand is probably not priority number one, it's probably not in the top 100, but what might this mean for New Zealand in a trade sense? There's a lot of CEOs, board people in the room with export businesses.
Right, well, there are what I call immediate issues that need to be addressed by New Zealand companies. And then there is a really complicated longer-term question about, we've lived all our lives, well, everyone in this room has lived all their lives within a framework of constrained power, to go back to the theme of this conference. What is the long-term impact of these changes on the concept that international business and global supply chains need to have some degree of stability in what the rules of the game are? I mean, this is, you repeat this like political cant, business needs some degree of certainty, but this is not cant. It's actually, what do you do if suddenly the tariff goes up to, 24% for aluminium? Well, given that it probably takes 10 years to establish an aluminium plant, what do? You invest $1 billion in the hope that that's not just a temporary measure. So on the immediate front, I see a number of issues. First of all, as I've argued, maybe some of you heard me, of course New Zealand's not the target of this, but bullets ricochet. Collateral damage will happen. And the question immediately is, well, what about the aluminium and steel tariffs? Because the last time he was president, he imposed them. And so, as it happens, I've made a suggestion to a very, very influential and powerful Australian 48 hours ago that if they successfully exclude Australian aluminium and steel from these tariffs, they should make the point at the same time that that would logically imply excluding Australian assets on the Shaky Isles, because they own it all. Slight exaggeration with respect to Tiwai Point. They own 80%, Sumitomo owns 20%. So there's these issues we have to navigate through. But there's also issues of a company-specific nature. And, I'm talking to a few companies on this, because it's not just a question of what the administration will do in terms of initiating action. It's also giving permission space to competitors of everybody, but most certainly including Australia and New Zealand, to try and take us out of the market. And that comes down to 3 or 4 instruments of contingency protection: CBD, anti-dumping, and Section 201 safeguards. And we would be completely naive to think that the lobbies that we compete with in the United States market are not going to be sniffing around for opportunities to either take us out or diminish the competition. It has happened before. We have literally seen this movie before. So people need to start preparing for that. And I won't get into it here because I don't think it's very helpful sometimes to talk in public about these things.
Thank you. Leon, on trade, your take?
Yeah, I liken it. I think we've got to trust our technique and face every ball that comes down for the over, and not get terrified that it's going to be six bounces from Joel Garner. So I think we've got to, as Tim has laid out, I think be very agile about how we think about it. I was in an argument this morning with Brad Olson, and he knows a heck of a lot more about inflation than I do. But what I was saying is that with European tariffs on electric vehicles and American tariffs on electric vehicles from China, we're probably going to have very cheap cars in New Zealand. The prices are going to continue to fall. And also whiteware and washing machines and all that sort of thing. So we actually might find that China, in the short term, we're going to get a lot of cheap goods coming down here, which could actually be quite to our benefit. And then I saw, Chrystia Freeman from Canada saying, we're going to stop every Tesla car, 100% tariffs on a Tesla car, and not a drop of Wisconsin milk's going to make it across the border. Now, she's running to be the leader of her party at the moment, so she'll be saying these things. Now, I'll be loath with all the Fonterra people in the room, particularly Simon Tucker, to suggest that Canada's a great market for New Zealand. But the milk has to come from somewhere. And if it doesn't come from New Zealand, that'll open up other opportunities as well for us. But I do think we need to prepare ourselves in a way that protects us from the economic coercion. And at the moment, we're a freeloader in the South Pacific in terms of defence spending. And if we don't address that with urgency, we make ourselves a target.
Yeah, I think we've got a thread on defence that I want to pick up in just one moment, Rebecca.
Yeah, what I wanted to say about that was actually Trump's tariffs and tough talk and his trade war with China during his first administration was one of the few things that he did, or one of the few policies that he pursued, that actually had pretty widespread support from among Democrats and from among Americans. It serves him well domestically, politically, and so I think we can expect to see more of that.
Yeah, no, I recall my time 25 years ago living in the States, tariffs and protectionism to, give workers in Western Pennsylvania job protection would have been a Democratic policy. It wasn't. It's changed a lot.
Well, he justified the tariffs on the basis of fentanyl. And going back to the very first question, the television news has to cut the highlights, and in between the highlights sounds like a whole lot of drivel. But there might be 20 minutes in his 3 hours talking about the loss of the 90,000 young people in America to fentanyl deaths, and the Ohio and the Oklahoma families where this curse is raging through those states. That meant a lot. The crowd, the MAGA crowd, will start weeping at that moment. That stuff never makes it on the TV news, but he was communicating it. So using fentanyl as a mandate to get to address the border issues with Mexico will be very popular amongst MAGA.
And we've seen an immediate reaction in response to those tariffs. So you'd have to say at the first point, or the first gate anyway, he has been successful. The threat of them was successful enough to get Mexican troops on the border, to have Canada also come to the party in terms of immigration. So it was
a political success, no doubt.
Yeah.
So, all right, I'm going to move from trade. There was a lot of interest in that, and I may come back to it. But linked defence. So, Leon, can you pick that thread up to start us off? We've heard from a Minister of Finance this morning who does not have a lot of fiscal room to move. We've got a relatively small military, given we've got about the same coastline as the continental US, New Zealand does, just a little bit less in the middle of those two coastlines. What's your take on the Trump administration's expectations of New Zealand, or the ricochet impacts on us around will we need to spend more in defence?
Tim will be closer to this than I will, but I have some contacts in DC, and they don't expect New Zealand to have assets that will be the tip of the spear in the South China Sea. They expect us to keep the back door closed. They expect us to look after the Southwest Pacific and to be able to do our bit, as do the Australians. And so, as a good example of an asset, so this isn't about ballistic missiles, in terms of defence spending. The Aotearoa is an incredibly valuable asset in Antarctica, which I chair the Board of Antarctica New Zealand. It's down there refuelling McMurdo Station at the moment and Scott Base. Incredibly valuable in the region, incredibly valued by our partners and our friends. So there are assets, naval ships, the Canterbury is extremely valuable in times of cyclones, civil disturbance and getting things up to the Pacific. So having a capable navy. I mean, our navy is out of the only ship that will last the next 10
Do we
years
have a capable navy?
is the Aotearoa. There's no other ship that will survive the next 10 years. The rest are dying in the next 5 or 6 years. So we can't play our part to our Pacific partners on organised crime, drugs which have been trafficked through the Pacific. So the great news is, not only is this the expectation on us, but doing it is the right thing to do. We've been coasting since the Cold War on 1% spending. It's not enough for us to play our part. We have to search and rescue from the equator to the Ross Sea. It's 30 million square kilometres. If we don't, we use it or lose it.
Yeah. Tim, your take on the defence question?
Oh, I don't think I can add anything much to that. I mean, we all know that that percentage figure will be under attack. And of course, they don't expect us, to develop supersonic missiles. There will still be pressure on this government to increase this. This is incredibly difficult for the government, given the fiscal realities facing it. So they're going to have to create a narrative that is credible and realistic. I don't want to go into it for the very obvious reason that I don't actually understand what is going on, but what is going on in the Cook Islands is potentially very important in this framework. And, I mean, I don't think, well, unless the government actually has a clear idea of what this understanding that the Cook Islands Prime Minister is going up to, I mean, they say in public, they themselves don't know. But this is going to be an immediate issue which plays into this broader defence agenda.
Yeah. So tomorrow at noon we'll have a session on geopolitics and defence where we'll explore this, including Murray McCulley, who I think may have honorary residence in the Cook Islands and is certainly pretty familiar with it. So we'll dive into that.
Murray's got to be an honorary resident somewhere.
Yes. We'll strike that from the record. I'll take another branch off that same question, and it weaves together trade and defence. Are we going to have to choose? Are we going to get to the point where largest trading partner China, are we in that camp, or second largest trading partner and more traditional military ally US, we're in that camp? Is that too simple?
No, it's not too simple. Obviously, that issue has existed, and it's going to get a lot tougher. I'm very pleased that when I was invited up by these Trump insiders to Washington a week before last, I met a certain gentleman, not the man who's been chosen as their ambassador, but another gentleman who wanted to be ambassador here. And I went to a certain person and said, if God really likes New Zealand, she will ensure that this gentleman does not become ambassador to New Zealand. And it was all about that issue. This is going to get very tough. And I can only repeat what I've said in public many times with the same metaphor, which is that however difficult it may be, we need to continue to ride two horses at the same time. That's the circus we're in. And that's not always going to be possible. I understand that. To use the metaphor, horses, if they get too unshackled, you fall in between. But it's going to require a great deal of political skill to do this. And I don't think there's a single formula that we can recommend. This has to be played issue by issue with great care. But it is going to get very tricky. I mean, this comes down to the biggest geopolitical question of all, which is, what is the world that we're moving into? I mean, we're moving clearly since 2016 from the era of hyperglobalization, which was picture perfect for this small but useful little country, into well, what is it? Is it fragmented globalization in which you actually do have to make these choices? Or is it something even darker like that, where, you know, even Canada, for God's sake, is facing, you know, overt threats to its sovereignty and to its trading relationship with the United States? So, I mean, anyone who says they know the answers to this doesn't know what they're talking about. We'll see how this plays out, but most assuredly, that issue that's been facing us really for about 10 years is about to get a lot tougher.
Are there other views on that?
It's a simple question with a very complex answer, and Tim's covered it. But I think that from my perspective, and from a business perspective, it's different business sectors in New Zealand have different interests. But I think the fundamental, and I think we've played it well in a bipartisan way for the last, you know, since 2008, we've gone out of our ways not to be rude to the Chinese, and we shouldn't be rude to the Chinese. We should continue that policy has worked well. But, you know, it being from the tech business, you know, 20 years ago, we made the decision, the choice. We built our businesses on American systems. AWS, Azure, Microsoft systems, and why did we do that? Is it, you know, as opposed to WeChat in the tech sector? And the answer is because our systems and their business processes are designed for the privacy of the individual. They're designed around the way that we live our lives and our society, how it's structured as a Western liberal society. China's systems and their platforms don't have those structures. So if we want to become global, we have to choose one that represents our society and that can sell it to these other societies. So the choice is already been making for tech. You know, it's long gone. And so it's sort of a bit of a null question for tech. Obviously for commodities, it has its own dimension. High-end manufacturing, New Zealand has to think about it. Rocket Lab, and Tim pioneered the agreement between the US and the New Zealand governments that enables Rocket Lab to thrive in New Zealand and in the United States. So there's models there for the high-end manufacturing industry.
And if I can interrupt you on that, because I think you're absolutely right. In certain areas, a choice has to be made, and we did make that choice, as you said, with Rocket Lab. And I remember when Peter Beck came in to see me, he said, we're going bankrupt. I said, what's the issue? He said, because of US export controls administered by an extraordinarily clever person, Rose Gottemuller, who later became Secretary General of NATO. And we had to construct a purpose-built system with the United States that involved the transfer formally of Rocket Lab into an American company, but would allow the continued export of highly sensitive, not just technology, but also people who were essential to Peter's extraordinary enterprise. So, you know, I 100% agree, and that's a clear case where we were forced to make a choice. We made, in my opinion, absolutely the right choice. And that could be a paradigm that will instruct us in the next few years. You know, the complication here is, where the hell are the Americans going to go with China? I mean, there's Elon Musk, the president's first buddy, and he's just, so amidst all this anti-China, you know, stuff, Elon Musk has just filed a legal complaint against the European Union for applying a 7.8 countervailing duty against the export of Tesla from Shanghai. I mean, this just is, you can't digest this stuff. I mean, it's almost comical, but for the fact that it's so serious. And then, you know, I don't want to get into a flight of fancy here, but what is the chess game going to deliver? You know, he's clearly going to enforce a ceasefire on Ukraine. He will need some support from President Xi. What do you think President Xi's price will be? De-escalation of the 65% tariffs in the war? Who knows? Yeah. You know, and Mike, go back to my central point. I personally do not think that President Trump knows. We will find out.
So can I there was a lot of that
Yeah.
little thread. Can I pick up a question here? Are we, and it's the two horses, are we heading into a bipolar world or a tripolar world where everyone has to choose? And, you know, obviously you go to the Cold War analogy. That was marked, at least in the West, by the projection of this camp values democracy, and therefore we're going to go in and, you know, try to save the world from the scourge of communism. This isn't an American administration that is seeking to project its positive universal values out into the world. It's seeking to do deals. But do you see us going into a world of two camps where people are going to have to be in one camp or the other, and we may have parallel economic systems?
Sorry, Tim.
With respect to specific areas like the one that Leon and I have just discussed, the answer is yes. But with respect to the overall superstructure of international relations, on verra, we will see. So what I can see is one scenario in which the clear identity of interest of Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Korea, all the European countries, including the Brits post-Brexit, all point towards a fragmented globalization system in which some version, not of a whole single global system, but a system of Western democratic countries, West defined politically, not geographically. I mean, that's a scenario for the big framework. We'll wait and see.
Rebecca?
I was going to say that I was reading the former Danish Prime Minister, I think, saying that the age of US leadership internationally is over, and that the world's police officer has gone rogue. And I liked it. It was simple. And it's how we're all feeling at the moment, right? There is a lot of instability. We don't know what's going to happen next. President Trump last week, I think, could have been the week before, they seem like years stretching between these events at the moment, stood up and announced that he wanted to make Gaza the Gold Coast. So, you know, it's an unpredictable environment. And what the former Danish Prime Minister was saying was that actually it's going to be these regional alliances, that Trump isn't going to stop being Trump, but and what needs to happen is that Europe needs to get together in terms of security or bouncing back in terms of trade tariffs. Down here you can see that maybe there's more work for us to do with Australia, particularly with the withdrawal of aid into the Pacific. So it's impossible to see where it will end, but you know, I agree that the age of US leadership globally, anyway, for now, they're an unreliable partner, and it feels like it's over.
I agree with that at the political level. I disagree with it fundamentally at the way that the US operates. You're right, the administration doesn't give a fig about projecting normative values, right? It doesn't give a fig about that at all. But the reality is America does that without trying. It's just so dominant. Its culture is so dominant globally, and it is an attractor. So whether you know, for the period of the Trump presidency and thereafter, I can't see this supertanker that is an American democracy actually not having the influence on us and continuing to have that influence on us.
Culturally and socially,
Culturally and
yes.
politically. But I mean, the Danish Prime Minister can say that, and Chrystia Freeland can say that.
But things are changing dramatically, aren't they? When you have the leader of the free world standing up and announcing in front of Benjamin Netanyahu that he wants to make Gaza into the Gold Coast, I mean, where do you go with that?
I wasn't picking it.
Well, no, I don't think it was on anyone's bingo card.
Kushner Real Estate Limited, I think.
So can I?
Yeah, but you know, behind all of these things or beneath them, you know, if you get rid of the heat and the noise, you can say, well, Trump threw that into a vacuum by the international community about what comes next for Gaza, for Palestinians. It's not as though we see, you know, Arab countries sending peacekeepers into that region, talking about a post-Hamas government or any of these things. So he's throwing it into a vacuum, and it is a challenge to everybody else, I suppose, to get out of that, number one, but to come up with an alternative.
So can I take this conversation to aid? Tim, you and I must have crossed paths. I was in DC a couple of weeks ago, caught up with a very dear friend in the aid field. US aid has been put into the State Department.
The wood chipper.
And you know, not dissimilar from ours. I'm interested in views on that. But a lot of the political rhetoric around USAID has been that it's been largely funding diversity and equity and inclusion programs and sort of, gender-neutral operas in Mexico or something. So I was talking with people that, were leading humanitarian medical and food supplies into Ukraine who have been stood down from their work. Don't come in, your email's turned off.
Well,
what's the take on the change, because we don't know if it's withdrawal yet, what's the take on the change of whatever it is, 50, 60, $70 billion of US aid? If they do something vastly different with that, what does that do to things like America's role in the Ukraine, America's role in the Middle East, or in the Pacific?
Well, if you take opinion in Washington, you'll get a single view because 90% of them vote Democrat. But if you went down to South Carolina, you will get a very different response. So, the brutality with which this is being done just appalls me as a person. But there's clearly been overreach by the far left in the United States that has provoked this brutal reaction against it. And, one of the things that has influenced my thinking a great deal in my life is a phrase I actually learned when I was living in Geneva, so it's in French, I'll translate it in a minute, la puissance d'une idée en marche, the power of an idea on the move. And as much as important as the specific actions of Trump, it's also the power of the ideas that he's unleashed that will cross through the world. In fact, I feel them already. So on DEI, for example, this is not look, I'm just giving you a man on the street view of it. I'm not an expert in this area. But, who other than a complete idiot, if you decompose it, would say diversity, I don't like that, I want everyone to be the same. Inclusiveness, oh, no, we want to exclude people. Equality, no, we want inequality. But the issue, as always, comes down to implementation. And when it's been taken far too far, what just happened is it's ended up in the corporate trash can. So we are seeing, one group has gone out here, we're seeing the yang coming back for the yin. It's all going to take a bit of time, and it will affect political debates in this country because the power of ideas is part of the deal of Trump.
I'll add to what Tim's saying. To survive this, we have to look to the actions rather than the public, performances. And like with Colombia, shackled prisoners is just great TV, in terms of the immigration debate. And aid, USAID is an autonomous organisation inside of the DC belt, and they look at it and think, we've got no influence on it, and it doesn't serve American interests. Now, the brutal way they've done that, which you've just described, I'm not defending that. But Murray McCully put New Zealand aid into MFAT to make sure it was aligned with New Zealand interests.
Yeah.
And so the idea that America is going to stop giving aid, I don't believe that. I think that America will be giving aid, and they'll be giving it in a way that some people will despise and some people will like. But I think the aid will flow. They just don't think that's the mechanism for USAID to be being delivered. It's the speed that I think Elon Musk has provided, and also the experience of being in power that is unsettling. But and it goes back to Tim's point earlier about the wafer-thin majorities, and he can quickly lose all his popularity. So there are checks and balances. The states themselves are a check and a balance, not just the three branches of government. So I think he will change the direction of the supertanker, but it'll just be a little bit more of a change. And for us to navigate it, we have to look at what is the real actions, not what's the noise.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because with USAID in particular, just stopping all of that funding, there are real-world consequences. But it was also strategically probably a good place to start because many Americans, it happens abroad. It's not going to affect many Americans. So you can get a blueprint there for how to disestablish or reconfigure an entire US government agency. And I think that many Americans will have sympathy for perhaps not with the speed with which it's been done, but with some scrutiny and real change, I suppose, being brought to the federal government. It will be very hard to drum up, I think, too much sympathy outside of Washington, D.C. for an overhaul. These institutions do demand scrutiny. Public institutions, that's what we all want. I don't know if we all want it in the way that Elon Musk is delivering it, but, the principle is sound.
So can I'm conscious we've only got a few minutes left. I want to start orienting us towards the future. This is about America at the Crossroads.
We're through the Crossroads, I think.
I think we've
We're out
blasted
of
through the
control.
Crossroads. So we just don't know which one of the roads we're on yet.
Yeah.
So how old's Trump now? 82? 81?
No, he's
79.
just
79.
79, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So conscious of, what we saw happen to Biden in the last 4 years, how he transformed as an older person. Let's look forward. Rebecca, do you see Trump as being at one end of the spectrum? He's a symptom, and at some point he won't be there, but this continues on. Or, people were saying for a while Ron DeSantis is a shorter Trump. He just withered. Is Trump a singular phenomenon? And in a post-Trump world, whether that's 4, 8, 12 years away, how do you see that transforming? Does somebody else pick up the mantle? Is this JD or somebody else?
I think he said recently that he didn't expect JD. I think he said this week that he didn't expect JD to be his successor.
I think it was something like, let's not assume that's going to happen.
Yeah. Listen, it is so hard just to get to grips with what is happening in this moment, an hour ago, 2 days ago, and how we got here, that I'm not going to look into the future and tell you what is ahead a month from now, let alone, years ahead. But I do think that President Trump, his legacy will be, well, there'll be many, but if you're talking about politics in America, it's the Republican Party. His hold and his reshaping of the Republican Party has been extraordinary to watch. Anybody during his first term, there were people within the Republican Party who tried to speak reason and tried to put up a defence to Trump, but they're all gone now, and you have a whole new sort of brand of Republican right throughout the party. So I don't know what the future holds in terms of him or his legacy or his successor, but he may even get another term. He's been talking about that recently. It's honestly too hard to tell. I think the Democrats, though, have a lot of work to do. They have a lot of work to do themselves.
Leon, can I ask you a version of the future casting question? So it's a little bit around, is Trump a singular phenomenon or a symptom? But also, fast forward, say we're sitting on the stage in 4 years. What's your take on where it will be? And I'll add a different flavour into this one. Do you think the fundamentals of US democracy will be the same, stronger, or weaker? Because there'll be different voters who would say, this is what's saving democracy, and some will be saying that we're on the edge of losing it. Where do you think that's going to go?
Oh, don't bet against America, is what I'd say. I think, picking up on the Democrat, I think the Democrat Party has to change. Generationally, it has to change. I mean, I saw Elizabeth Warren and Chuck Schumer at a protest, thumped, and they looked pathetic. And very close friends, Democrats in LA, they despise Trump. But actually, the thing that they're really focused on at the moment is looking in the mirror and ask, how did we, as overly educated white liberal elites, lose Latino working families, black working families, higher working families? These used to be Democrat strongholds. And so I think the Democrat Party is going to have to refashion itself. And I think it won't come from the people necessarily in DC, but it'll come out of the grassroots, and they'll have to become, politics is a competitive game. And they're going to work out what is it going to take to win this game. And I think that'll come out of the grassroots. So there'll be a lot of change there in the Democrats. I think that Trump and Elon Musk have got 2 years before the midterms. I shouldn't predict the election, but they should think that's why they're going so fast. They probably know they've only got 2 years. And then I think when you've got a divided presidency and a House then things will adjust again. But I think America has way too many shock absorbers to be able to affect. And, New Zealand's been through this. I mean, and in terms of us being sanctimonious, Kalhurua, Trump, porn star, Rob Muldoon described the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, Sonny Rumpal, as an orangutan who should return to the jungle. And that went around the world. So, we have to look in the mirror too, that democracy can create these things. So I'm very much let's not catastrophize it. I think America's going to be America.
Fascinating. And Tim, definitely I want to know your take on the future, but if you can, I'm also interested in your view on what Trump 2.0, how Trump 2.0 is different from 2016 to 2020 Trump.
Well, on that, to repeat a long conversation I had in other media, he is personally, I think, the same person on the grounds that somebody of that age is not likely to change, but the ecosystem around him has changed in very important ways, not just with the tech titans around him, but some very smart people like Scott Bessent and others around him, Chris Wright, the Energy Secretary. So we will see this plays out. In terms of the future, I think it's a very brutal reality. It'll depend on what happens to the bread and butter issues that affect the electorate of the United States. So he is, this is a man who's gone bankrupt by his own admission 3 times, others say it's 6 times. He takes enormous risks. There is clear danger of overreach here because I think he thinks he's invincible. If he pursued this tariff agenda, for example, I mean, not to the ludicrous extent of 24% on everything and blah, 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 but even significantly, it will affect prices. The only point of having protectionist measures, if you wish to stimulate domestic production, is to alter the competitive balance. And it doesn't work if you don't increase prices. So if he delivers, this continuing chaos, which means the inflation rate, which has already ticked up in terms of inflationary expectations by a whole percentile point, he'll be on his way out. But the corrective systems of the United States are there. I think the figure of J.D. Vance is very intriguing. I, speaking personally, when I read his book, Hillbilly Eulogy, which is so much superior to the film, by the way, I thought this guy is really special. This guy's really smart. What's his real game, given his earlier statements that sound like a card-carrying Democrat, Trump-hating person? He's married to a woman of Indian ethnic origin, so the white racist thing. What's his game? He's really smart, this guy. By the way, here's a little idea for you. Google J.D. Vance's speech to the Paris AI convention 2 or 3 days ago. It is fascinating, both in terms of giving you a picture about this guy. I challenge you, any of you, to walk away thinking anything other than he's a really smart guy. And I think he'll be the most consequential vice president for possibly since the war. And secondly, watch the body language of the terrified titans of European politics. It is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing, ladies and gentlemen. Trudeau is sitting there catatonic like this. And Ursula von der Leyen, the really smart person. And I suspect if I knew her, I'd get on like a house on fire. I hope the far right of the National Party's not listening to me when I say that. But, everything this guy is saying is like anathema. She looks nervously at Antonio Guterres, who's also looking catatonic. So, I'm just asking you to this. He is the inheritor of Trump, but he's smart enough to make changes.
We've got 1 minute left. If you look at this world and some of those figures you've just talked about, but also our own political leaders and frankly, all of ourselves as leaders or as voters and citizens, we have talked about politics for 40 years, for longer, with an ethical and a moral lens. we've talked about doing the right thing, and sometimes that's maybe projecting the normative values and then trying to do a deal, but that's been the narrative, at least, over the top. There is a thread through all of this that New Zealand, but many countries, are going to have to go transactional, because this is about it's about making deals and it's about looking after interests. Are we moving into a sort of post-ethical period, or a period where that narrative of we're here to help the world be a better place, environmentally, socially, economically, is actually in the dustbin, and we're here to look after the people that elected us?
Can I open up?
Absolutely.
No, it is not in the dustbin, but it requires some course direction. We'll handle the deal-making side. The Prime Minister will have an idea of what he can put on the table. I'm confident of that. But I don't think that ethical... I think it's a very good question you asked, Matt. I don't think that ethical basis to our politics will change, because I think the heart of New Zealanders is still in that space. At least I hope it is. I mean, of course, when it gets into absurd sanctimonious behaviour, makes me vomit. But fundamentally, we are an ethically based political conversation. We have an ethically based political conversation. And I know many Americans will be horrified by what is going on. But our natural allies and partners, which, doesn't mean we don't have differences with them, they're still part of that conversation. So I don't think it's gone, but it's going to require some course correction.
Fascinating. Leon?
In politics, I think the US is leading, and it's going to happen here. The voters want actions that produce results. They don't want policy frameworks. They don't want defined words or announcements about announcements. And I think Trump is all about that. I think going back to the economic discussion earlier, the European economy was the same size as the US 30 years ago. The US economy is now twice the size. Innovation, creative destruction, those are the things that have driven that, and less government, less regulation, and actions to achieve that. And that has actually, across the Democrats and the Republicans, has been the story, and this made the difference between the US and Europe.
Fascinating. Last word, Rebecca.
I'm honoured. I'm going to agree with Tim about our ethical heart, and have a slightly different take, which is that what we're witnessing President Trump do in the United States in the first 20 days alone will put pressure on our own Prime Minister to move faster, to be sharper, to get things done. If you're looking over to the United States and you're seeing 38 executive orders, I know we have a different system. They are, but there will be pressure on Christopher Luxon and on other leaders to sort of cut through the bullshit and start, delivering the things that they campaigned on. And I think we will feel that, if he's not feeling it already, down there in the beehive.
Fascinating. All right, that brings us to our allotted time. I'll explain a little bit this evening's program and tomorrow's in a moment, but before I do that, I just want to thank you for a fascinating discussion.
Yeah. We got there.